The trouble with introductions like that is it's followed by me, but you get used to it. Just to tell you a little bit about myself so that you know what you're in for. I didn't get it all right. I grew up in a blue-collar environment, the British equivalent of Detroit, basically. My parents left school at the age of 12. No one in our family had ever been to university till I went to university, so I'm starting from scratch, so to speak. Except that, of course, the British class system was oppressive in the same way that racism was in the States, so that if you were in the working class, getting out of it was virtually impossible, until Churchill was thrown out after the Second World War. He was a good wartime prime minister, but ordinary people knew they wouldn't get anything out of him. After all, he was born in one of the biggest palaces in England. He wasn't a peacetime prime minister, and we needed some changes. If I'd been born 3 or 4 years earlier, I wouldn't be here now, because education changed. When I was going to high school, I got a scholarship. I knew nothing about it. I didn't apply for it. My mother had ticked a form that went with an exam that every student had to take, and it simply said, "Do you wish your child to be considered for King Edward's School?" And she liked the uniform. She knew nothing about the school really, except that she'd seen the boys around. She did know something about it actually, because although she left home at 12, she was very smart, as I learned as the years went by. She ran a Sunday school on her own for 30 years with 2 weeks off each year. There'd be 50 kids aged 5 to 12, and there was never any problem with discipline, because she could sing, she could get them to sing, and she was a brilliant storyteller. I thought all mothers did that, and of course I discovered later that was not the case. So she also got an opportunity of further education, but my grandfather, who was a Marxist-trained union leader, wouldn't let her do it, because he said, "I have no favourites in this family." So she was a miserable teenager. But earning her living as a seamstress, which saved my father lots of money because that was way beneath her abilities, but it did mean she could stand in any bus queue, look at somebody's outfit, go home and make it. She didn't need anything so banal as a pattern. And amongst the people who I met as a little boy, actually, because they came to my mother to be fitted for their clothes, was an actress who had met my mother when she was doing night school Shakespeare, to which my mother had gone, and discovered what she could do, and could never get the kinds of clothes in the materials she liked. So she'd find the material and bring it to my mother, and my mother would make whatever she wanted. And her son had gone to that school. He'd been killed in the war, but that was, I think, where the pressure came from. And so I was translated into a very different school. I arrived at my first, as you would say, North America homeroom master, and he spoke 5 languages. I thought, so this is high school, and it was. Shortly, much to my own amazement, I was writing précis in 3 languages within a year or so. There were no bird courses in that school. It was real work all the while. And it was amazing, because the school took 100 boys a year from a population base of 6 million competitively, with 2 affirmative action places for working class boys, of which I was one. So I was bottom of the class to begin with. My final year at that high school, I think everyone in the class eventually became a professor. It was an extraordinary experience. Going to medical school was boring by comparison. So that's an incredible gift for a child to have. I had no idea what was happening to me. I loved it. I'd already done more than anyone in the family, so I must have been an absolutely arrogant little brat. Because every day I learnt something new. I'd be excited about it, and of course everybody else would have to hear about it, and it meant nothing to them. So that was the background. Then I went to London to do medicine. Now, up to that point, I'd gone to a little Brethren chapel, which had been very important to my parents. It had given stability to their life, and they were loyal to them throughout their life. But my father, who was also bright, he was well aware of their limitations, but also their strengths. But fortunately, when I went to London and went to our own church, it was dead. So I felt no compunction whatsoever to go back. And by the grace of God, another student who was a year ahead of me that I'd met in that first couple of days, he said, "Well, I'm going to church this evening, will you come with me?" And I said, sure. Where are you going? He said, I'm going to hear Martin Lloyd-Jones. And I didn't know who Martin Lloyd-Jones was. I came to think of him as the best preacher of the 20th century, Protestant preacher of the 20th century. So the choice most Sundays was between John Stott or Martin Lloyd-Jones. It's an invidious choice. And Lloyd-Jones won most often because he never taught anybody else. He wanted all the time in the pulpit himself, whereas John Stott was always training other people. That was the difference between them, really. But so I would listen to Lloyd-Jones sometimes 3 times a week. He had 3-hour-long sermons, some of which I can almost remember verbatim to this day. And sometimes when I'm travelling and I get a little tired, there's more Martin Lloyd-Jones than usual, and somebody will say, an older person obviously, like being back in the chapel, almost pure plagiary. Not quite, but I try to give appropriate credit. But, and here's the important thing, which is one of the reasons I'm talking to you tonight. Despite that experience for 5 years, it didn't get me through residency. I ceased to practice my faith, fairly swiftly actually, and it took 20 years to recover. And when that process was complete and I look back, I put it down to 6 things. And I want to tell you what they are, and I'd like a little feedback from you immediately if that's possible. Because I would say to you that to send your young people to university unable to deal with these issues is a risk you shouldn't take. The first one is reductionism. Do you know what it is? Do you know its history, its strengths and its weaknesses? The second one is relativism, particularly moral relativism, but the other 3 forms as well matter, but the moral one is the one that matters most. Can you identify it? And can you stop the people who are doing it and make them see their incoherence? Could your children stand up in front of their class and say, I am intolerant, and I can show you that over many issues you ought to be too? Can you deconstruct multiculturalism? Can you defend the sanctity of human life? And can you defend Judeo-Christian sexual ethics? Now, none of those 6 issues were covered by either Lloyd-Jones or Stott, as such. So not even to name the problems is a failure. Now, they didn't see them coming, is what it meant. They were underway at that time, but I mean, the pill had only just been invented in, in fact, it wasn't invented while I was going to Lloyd-Jones, so he might have said something about it afterwards. And the pill has changed our world completely, the contraceptive pill. It has destroyed our culture in many ways. It's not an accident that the rise in divorce exactly parallels the rise in the use of the contraceptive pill. I now believe that the Catholics are right on that issue and we need to repent. And I put it to you as a question. Can you coherently say to God, I want you to be in charge of all my life, and then add, except my fertility? That is not possible, is it? Not as a coherent statement. All you can say to God is, I want you to be in charge of all my life, except my fertility. And the question is that what you really want to say to him on Judgment Day? I didn't come to work this out until my first 2 children were married, and they married in a Protestant way. 3 of my children, much to my amazement, went to the altar as a virgin, which I did not do, and they have better marriages than we have because of that. The last 2 are both practicing natural family planning, which is as effective as the pill, but they have much better marriages. I can see the difference now. I know what's at issue here to a much greater extent. But that's just one of the 6 issues that I would suggest to you need to think about. And if your young people are not happy answering those questions, for goodness sake, don't let them go into what I call the physics envy programs, psychology, sociology, anthropology. Those are lethal programs, dominated by people who've made wrong decisions. Education is another, which is why you do what you do, isn't it? Fundamentally, actually, the Department of Education is my most hated faculty. If I had my way, I'd blow it up. I'd take the people out of it first, but I would get rid of it as a concept. They can do research as to how educational systems are working. Fine, I have no problem with that. But to pretend that they can tell us how to do it is a lie, because they've missed the point entirely. And when eventually I sorted this out, or at least Wendell Berry sorted it out for me in one sentence. How many Wendell Berries? I see we've got at least one Wendell Berry leader, and another one here, yeah, and others, yeah. So the Port William novels. Have you read, the first one's not in print, but have you read Watch With Me? Ptolemy and Miss Minnie? You have to find it. It's probably the best in some ways. They've all got good points, but this one's brilliant. Well, for the rest of you who do not know Wendell Berry, who's only one state over, isn't he? One state over? Yeah, one state over. The first novel, Watch With Me, is a love story between a great gawky farmer and a one-room schoolroom village teacher at the beginning of the last century. Horse and buggy days. And he can describe Ptolemy the farmer very easily in a sentence. He says, Ptolemy was a big man whose clothes looked as though they had been taken by surprise 20 minutes after he put them on. You've got the picture immediately. You know that kind of guy. A wonderful guy, warm-hearted, kind, but totally uncaring about his clothes and that sort of thing. But his farm was as neat as a farm can be. Miss Minnie, on the other hand, was the opposite. She was diminutive, the village teacher, and if a boy misbehaved, his father would be spoken to and he would be dealt with. And that school ran like clockwork. But in describing Miss Minnie, he says, Miss Minnie went to Teachers' College where she learnt many cunning techniques, which she never subsequently used, because Miss Minnie loved children and she loved books, and she taught by merely introducing the one to the other. That solved a problem for me in 1 Timothy 3 as well, the great chapter on leadership in the church. Because if you look at what Paul lists as being important for leadership, how would you categorize them? What does he tell us to look for in our leaders?
Demonstrated godly character and also some ability. So have to teach.
That was the problem for me, because that's the only place where some ability is listed. Everything else is character. So that sticks out like a sore thumb. But what Wendell Berry has just said, that apt to teach is not ability, it's a gift. It is ability in a sense, but it's not a skill, because it's composed of two loves. And you can't teach love, which is why the Faculty of Education is a disaster, because it's trying to teach something that cannot be taught. And you should look at that in your church. You know, you can see how the modern approach to education has ruined Sunday school, for instance, in that it's been turned into tacky art in most. It's basically child-minding. Whereas children who are going to Sunday school are at a point where there's one thing that they love above almost everything else, and what's that? Stories. Sunday school should be, in my view, entirely storytelling. And the stories should be the Bible stories. And they will sit and listen to that. I've got a good friend in Ottawa, a man called Richard Gantz, who was an Orthodox Jew. You know this man?
Yes, he's in a sister denomination, and I just happened to listen to him yesterday.
Really? Yeah. But you don't know his wife?
No, I don't. Never met him.
No. Well, Richard was an Orthodox Jew. In fact, he says he's the character in Asher Lev, the baseball-playing Orthodox Jew in the novels by... What's the name of the novelist now? Forgotten. It doesn't matter. And Orthodox Jew, got a PhD in psychology, and then, without any intervention from another human being, other than somebody putting a Bible into his hand in Amsterdam, and he read the crucifixion story for the first time and said, this is the key to Isaiah 53. And that brought him to faith, and his wife. And he got thrown out of the psychology department he was in because he got somebody to talk who hadn't spoken in 5 years, but by evangelizing him. So he was thrown out. But anyway, a few years ago now, I met him in the airport, and I was talking about this sort of thing, and he said, well, my wife has been doing something interesting. I'll send you a copy. For many years, he was a one-man band, and so his wife taught Sunday school, he taught adult Sunday school, and then he preached. So he didn't know what his wife did in Sunday school. He's a very competitive Jew, and people kept saying to him, you know, your wife is as good or perhaps better than you as a teacher. And he didn't like that. He admitted he didn't like it. And eventually he got to a stage where he had an assistant, so he could, so to speak, go and look through the keyhole at what his wife was doing. And she was telling stories to the children, and they were in tears. And when he found out what she'd actually done, he couldn't believe it. She had written commentaries for children on the Pentateuch. And that's what she was reading. And he sent me Genesis, and I tried it out on my grandchildren, and he taught them creation ex nihilo. These are children under the age of 6 in 2 pages. She had taught them. So, Nancy Gans, you have to go to Shepherd Press, commentaries on the Pentateuch for children. Brilliant. This fact that children are made this way, of course the medievals understood. You all know about the trivium, don't you? Yes? Say no if you don't. There's no harm in it. Okay, it's always wrong not to acknowledge what you don't know, because then you don't learn. When you acknowledge what's wrong, you remember it even better. The medievals, who were deeply Christian, therefore thought about the world by thinking what God had done. And they asked a very simple question. How has God made children? What can we learn from looking about what they do when they arrive? And of course, it didn't take them long to realize, this is the first thing the Faculty of Education gets totally wrong. What's the one thing your under 5s can do better than all of you? Memorize. Memorize, exactly. If you want to prove this, have a competition with your under 5s to learn a psalm. And they'll beat you every time. The famous story of Dr. Johnson, who was apparently, you can understand it, a bit of a problem as a little boy. He was so precocious. And one Sunday morning he was giving his mother a very hard time, and she said, go upstairs and learn the collect for the day. That's the prayer for the day in the Anglican service. He got to the top of the stairs and shouted down, done that. And he had. That's what their memories are like. So the medievals said, right, memorization, because they love it. They like chanting tables. They like learning nonsense verse. They just enjoy the rhythms. They can memorize anything. I think they remember everything that's said to them in the first 5 years. And that's very important. I became aware of this as a problem much later. And I'm a bit like Galileo in the sense that I will do thought experiments and not bother to do the experiment. Galileo did that quite frequently. Usually he was right. And on this one I was right too. But in Texas I said to a group of people that my guess would be that if you tested your children in Sunday school, age 7 and 8, on their knowledge of Bible stories, and you compared that with their knowledge of the ads that have run on television over the last 5 years, you would have a very nasty shock, because the ads would win hands down. And shortly afterwards I got an email from a lady in Texas said, I've done the experiment, you're absolutely right. They don't make those ads because they don't work, but because they do work. They've got your mind in a box and they can call on it when they wish. I think if a man in particular loves his children, when the first one comes along he should put a boot through the television. I don't think children should see any advertising before the age of 8, because it's too powerful. It's just imprinted instantly and completely. And of course television advertising doesn't legitimize anything good, does it? Materialism, greed, you name it. It's not good news. We were fortunate that we didn't expose our children to it. A, because we weren't in a place where television worked. We were in Jamaica for most of the early years of my children, and there the only television we had was a permanent snowstorm anyway, so we didn't have it. I mean, other people had it. They still had them, although they didn't work. And when we left there, and after a brief stay in Britain came to North America, I said to my children, who were by that stage in junior school, the television here has innumerable channels, none of which, as far as I can see, are really worth watching, but what do you want to do? We had a discussion. And bless them, they said, we played more games and we read more books in Jamaica than we did in England. We won't have a television. So we didn't have a television. My oldest daughter was very, very sociable in public school in those days, but she found out very quickly she didn't need to see the programs they were watching. She could tell them what the next episode was going to be before it happened. But she didn't see any ads, but she had absolutely no trouble in predicting what the television soap operas and the like were going to do next, because they were so predictable. But she didn't see the ads, and neither did my children. And that's a wonderful thing to have done. So the trivia starts with memorization. Children can learn the whole of the Psalms. They can learn all their times tables. You can put good poetry into their minds. My mother, that I've already introduced you to, thought that children in Sunday school shouldn't learn verses, they should learn chapters. And we did. And I bless my mother for that every now and again. Things pop into my head from 60 years ago that I learnt then, and whoa, it's still there when it's needed. I mean, the Holy Spirit can do that. But you can't recall what's not there. But it's a very important step one, memorization. So the first one is memory. The second is logic, and we don't teach that at all. Classical logic, not mathematical logic, but the classical logic. The law of non-contradiction, the undistributed middle, ad hominem attacks, all the classical bits that every medieval monk would do. Now I can say to very smart students in the university, I would do it routinely. I would put into the lecture an obvious logical error, and they wouldn't pick it up. I mean, the bright ones started enjoying the game, and I did teach them some logic in the long way, but I could even get away with this, for instance. See how many of you pick it up. Or not, even though I'm telling you, I'm going to do it to you. I would say in giving a lecture on the biochemistry of exercise, that if you're fit, you don't need exercise, and if you're sick, you shouldn't take it. What do you say? That's right, you're frowning, and that's appropriate. Shall I repeat? If you're fit, you don't need exercise. If you're sick, you shouldn't take it. Perfectly correct. It's the undistributed middle. What I've done in your head is divide the world into two groups of people, but the world is not so divided. There are very few fit people, very few sick people, and a large bunch of slightly lazy slobs like me in the middle. You're having your politicians doing it at the moment in this amazing comic farce that's going on at the moment. It's either me or disaster. No. It's probably a disaster with either of you, but fortunately there's a large undistributed middle sitting there where you won't be able to do quite as much damage as we fear you might. It's probably not going to be that bad. But people don't know that. And the people who come to the program that grew out of our response to these limitations, Augustine College, all the students who take that course, they do not get caught by that anymore. One of our young ladies ended up in medical school in Ann Arbor, a good medical school in University of Michigan. First term, within a week or two, a guy was teaching embryology, and he got off track in a pro-choice rant about how pro-life people make so much fuss about these tiny little early creatures which really have no significance as human beings. They're not human beings, they're just cells. And she raised her hand, which doesn't happen in first year, I assure you. And he saw it and said, "Do you have a problem?" She said, "Yes, sir, I do. What you have just done is an ad hominem attack on pro-life people, and that is disgraceful in a professor. I think you should apologize." That's courage. And he was shocked. He didn't apologise, of course. Maybe I was a trifle excessive, and he moved on. But the important point was at the end of that lecture, about 40 of the students came and said, well done. And a pro-life group was formed, which brought two groups that need to know they belong to one another together immediately, namely Orthodox Catholics and Evangelical Protestants. When it comes to public policy, we are well past the stage when we can afford the nonsense of family squabbles. We've got to get our act together if we're going to survive. Otherwise we'll be in trouble. She did that. That's what classical logic can do for you. But it's not taught. Not taught in the university. We teach mathematical logic, which is very sad. But there are some good little books around that you can use in homeschooling that would help you to do that. So that's what you do when your children and grandchildren start saying how and why, then you teach them logic. Only after that, when they've got that all straight, do you teach them rhetoric, how to present it. Whereas your current president, for instance, is a master of rhetoric without any logical content. I heard him when he was a senator, and I recognized good rhetoric, and I said, gee, he's good at this. I will never listen to him again. He's Saruman, if you like. I'll read what he says. I was fascinated to see in the last inaugural that one of the editorial writers in the Washington Post said, you will be surprised that I did not listen to our president yesterday. And he said, his rhetoric is too good, but there was no content. I read what he said. We're not very good at critiquing. And don't go for critical thinking courses. They're a rip-off. You can't do it. And you actually know that if you stop and think. Probably all of you have a hobby, right, of some sort, something you like doing. Hopefully you do. And if that's the case, and you go and look at some work of that sort, you can rank order what you're looking at very quickly. Oh, that's very good, that's not so good. In my own field of medicine, I can go to any town, and if I ask a bunch of physicians, who's the best internist, who's the best surgeon, I don't get a random scattering of names. It's the same names that turn up. When I ask them, why is he the best physician, or why is he the best surgeon, they can't answer the question immediately. They know before they tell you the answer, and what they tell you is a rationalization of what they already know. The best example in our Christian lives of this, of course, is our conversion. Many of our churches persuade our young people to have a conversion story that fits the model of the church, right? Do you remember those days when you were a teenager, when you had your testimony that you gave, which wasn't it wasn't intentionally untrue, but it wasn't true either, in the sense that it was incomplete. Lewis is very good on this in his description of his own coming to faith in Surprised by Joy. If you haven't read it, do read it, but I can save you some time. Don't bother with the first bit of the book. Start when he gets to Oxford. Before that, it's just about horrible British preparatory schools and public schools, and you don't really want to know about that. But he arrives in Oxford as an atheist. Very smart. He thinks he's the best debater in Oxford until Margaret Anscombe beats him, and then he never debates again after. Margaret Anscombe was a cigar-smoking Catholic theologian, a remarkable woman, to say the least. But he was very good at it. But he wasn't a debater because he doesn't complete his arguments because he's such a brilliant illustrator. That's the key to reading Lewis in many ways. But anyway, he gets his first degree out of the way and gets a first class, but there's no job. His father's rich enough, so he does a second degree in the English program. And he goes to his first tutorial, 8 or 9 people. And how long does it take smart kids to find out who the smart kids are in a group of 8 or 9? 2 minutes, 3 minutes, one sentence from each, it's enough. Certainly by the end of that first tutorial, he knows that there are 2 minds in that class that he's going to have to deal with, and much to his chagrin, they're both Christian. In fact, there were 3 people in that tutorial group who were going to have an important influence on British Christianity. He was one of them, but of course he didn't know that at that point. And they persuade him that it is stupid to be an atheist. it's much more sensible to be a theist. You have to believe one or the other. Atheism is a belief system as well. In fact, it's a stupid belief system because it can never be proved to be true because it's a universal negative. But Lewis knew that. So over the first week or two, he is persuaded that theism makes much more sense. And being logical, he said, if I'm going to believe in a God, I'd better pray, which he'd never done before as an adult. And he says, I got down on my knees, and for the first time in my life, I tried to make a thorough examination of myself. And I discovered that I was a zoo of ambition, a bedlam of hatred, a harem of fondled hatred. That's an academic. The most petty people on earth we are. We never forget. And if you cross us, we will wait years to get our own back. That's what happened to Galileo. He upset another Jesuit physicist. It was nothing about faith and science. It was about pride. And he made a mistake. He pushed it too far, and that Jesuit nailed him. That's what happened. And Lewis knew about that. He said, looking back, he said he was picked up and carried, kicking into and struggling into the kingdom, perhaps the most unhappy man in England that night. But that made him an uncomfortable theist. It didn't make him a Christian. And he tried to escape into deism. That didn't work. And then he comes to his conversion as such. And because of his honesty and his really brilliance in description, he describes getting on a bus at Magdalen College in Oxford to go the 5-minute journey to Headington, just up Headington Hill. Double-decker bus, probably. Sitting on top of the bus. And he says, I was offered something. He says, it was like taking off a suit of armour, removing stiff clothes, being a snowman pushed out into the sun and beginning to melt. It was unpleasant. I mean, that's 3 mixed similes. It doesn't tell you anything about what happened. Looking back at it, he's quite sure that that's when he said yes to God. And then he says, I didn't know what to do with Jesus. And then he goes and watches the wallabies jumping around in the bluebells at Whipsnade Zoo with his brother for an hour or two. And when he comes back, he does believe in Jesus as the Son of God. He doesn't tell you why, because he doesn't know. And he spends the rest of his life helping the rest of us to be honest about our faith and how it works. The most important knowledge in our lives, we don't know how it's done. None of you know how you became a Christian. It wasn't your doing, was it? Almost invariably, if you came from a Christian background, there's no new information, is there, when you become a Christian? I knew the story backwards and forwards. I wasn't a Christian. John Wesley was a missionary in America, and a pain in the backside to boot, but there was nothing new. I mean, he visited the sick and the prisoners, and he did everything right, and he wasn't a Christian. Until he went to that little mission in the back streets of London. It wasn't even the Bible they were reading. It was somebody in broken English reading Luther's Introduction to the Romans. And he says, for the first time, I knew that I was a child of God. That's all he can say. Clearly his life changed, and he changed the whole history of Britain in the process. And in fact, in the modern world, it's much better, especially in the university, to handle your conversion in that way. I love it when I meet occasionally somebody who knew me in my days as a trendy scientist before I became an explicit Christian. And if they're British and they turn up at a lecture nowadays, because you get your mugshot up and my hair colour's changed, but I'm still recognisable, they'll be very rude and say, we'll say hello and then say, I haven't seen you for years. I say, no, I don't go to the meetings where we used to meet. He said, I know, I stopped reading your rubbish. I stopped reading your work in the 90s. You write rubbish now, don't you? And I say, oh, you think I lost it? They'll say, yeah, more or less. And I think I can prove that's wrong. What do you call somebody who's lost their mind? Of course, the answer is crazy. What happens to their life? Falls apart. Well, you can even ask my wife. She'll tell you when I started taking faith seriously, my life didn't fall apart. It fell together, if anything. Your problem is that you conceive of your understanding of what knowledge is as being a total description. It's not. There's plenty of room within my religious understanding for the practice of reductionistic science, but not the other way around. Your box is too small. Don't get sorted out. I can't tell you how to become a Christian. I would never tell anybody how to become a Christian except search and you will find. That's all the Bible tells me. I don't believe in these reductionistic. The gospel is reduced, isn't it, frequently in church. Do you become a Christian when you sign a set of boxes? Tick, God, tick, Jesus, tick, into my life, sign here, you're a Christian. Not because of that. It can be, and I think the four spiritual laws have allowed many people to realize, my goodness, Christ has got in my life somehow. I think they actually discover that they are Christian. Because we all do, don't we, in a way. It's one of the wonders of the universe, and nobody knows how it's done. Except that Jesus tells Nicodemus, doesn't he, straightforwardly. You can't get to where you want to go from where you are now. That's what he says to him. Unless you're born of the Spirit, you can't comprehend what it's all about. It's analogous to seeing, isn't it, for the first time. So, tacit knowledge is what Polanyi calls it. And it's very important. It's very important to start talking about your faith in that kind of way before you get into the university. Because you can do it by questions. The other thing the younger ones here need to think about now, before you go to university, make yourself a little plaque that you can stick on your fridge, which says, don't make statements, ask questions. The only safe way to survive in the university. Don't make statements, ask questions. And when you're asked to do something wrong, which if you go into medicine you will be, don't say no to the person telling you to do it, the mentor, the boss. Say, before I obey you, may I ask you a question? They have to say yes. And then you say, this is clearly not an issue of morality to you, but it is to me. Do you want your family to be cared for by a doctor with or without moral integrity? Gotcha. There's nobody, not even Obama, who wants a doctor without moral integrity for his family. But he wants to make sure that you have one without moral integrity for yours. That's not fair, is it? That's not just. The argument is about justice and democracy, not about religion. Medicine is a moral activity, and those that rule us at the moment are saying they know what the limits of that morality should be. Oh, seriously? On what grounds? Mine's a much richer story than this, and it's been around a lot longer, and it's taken a lot more knocks. But we've got to stand up and be counted, and we've got to be subtle about it and clever. So back to the story of homeschooling and the rest. I went through that kind of training and did a lot of research, and then was pulled out of my comfort zone by students primarily, and by the fact that I discovered that two missionaries had prayed for me for 30 years, that I would become a Christian, that I would become a doctor, and that I would go to the Belgian Congo. And my father didn't tell me that till I called him in England and said, much against my will, we're going to the Congo next year for a year. And he said, I waited 47 years to hear you say that. At which point I gave in. God is very patient, very patient. So then I come back to the university with vision changed a little bit. My beginning to look at the students with a little bit more attention than before. Up until that point, I had looked upon the university as being a wonderful place, somewhat ruined by the presence of students. That began to change. God is amazing the way He does it. One of the main players at this particular point in this change was, of all things, a homosexual Jew from the University of Chicago, whose book you may have read, called The Closing of the American Mind. Anyone read it? It's a bit, yeah, you're doing well, because it's quite an old book now. It's 30 years old, I would think. Only the first chapter is worth reading, really. You can forget the rest. But he got to me because I read that book on my first trip to Africa, because I thought I needed a thick book to get me there, and only the first chapter was worth it. But it didn't leave me alone for the year, because Alan Bloom would have a good chance of winning the prize of the best teacher of Aristotle and Plato in North America in the last 40 years. And he wrote that book because the American education system was serving up students who he couldn't work with. They weren't ready for him, and he didn't wish to do the remedial training. And the problem is interesting. in the opening chapter, which is called The Empty Slate, and the empty slate is the current student, they're really bereft of any philosophical, theological structure for their lives. And he can't teach philosophy on an empty slate. He says the only thing you could be certain of, this is way back then, it's still true, is that they will all believe that all truth is relative. Well, that's logic gone down the tube in one sentence, because to say that all truth is relative is to make an absolute statement to prove that absolute statements don't exist. That's the law of non-contradiction gone, that's the whole of logic gone, that's learning gone, there's nothing left. We're just animals, and we're moving in that direction. So he wrote the book because of that. And at the end of that first chapter, there's an absolutely stunningly beautiful couple of paragraphs, about 2 or 3 paragraphs from the end of the first chapter. And he's looking back at his own family history, and some of you may have some sympathy with this. He was a third-generation Jew in America. His grandparents had arrived with nothing from Eastern Europe, so they worked in the sweatshops. His parents owned sweatshops. And he and his cousins, as he says, are all MDs and PhDs. The classic 3-generation Jewish success story. But he says, my grandparents were humble folk who never went inside an institution of higher learning. But everything done in their home was spiritually rich. They found reasons for the performance of their duties and the bearing of their sorrows by reference to the book, the Old Testament. And they could go to the synagogue, where they heard great scholars who spoke not from an alien perspective, but from the same perspective, while simply going deeper and providing guidance. That, says Bloom, this is the most brilliant definition of a community I know. That, says Bloom, is what a community is. Something that invites high and low into a common story of meaning. America is not a community. It's not a society. It's a collection of societies and subsets who are agreeing to live together currently for material reasons. We have got to start thinking about our own story, our own community, in rather more carefully than we've done to date, because it is fracturing. You can see it, can't you? Even those of you who are in your 40s or late 30s or wherever it is, the world has changed in your lifetime. In my lifetime, it's beyond belief. Beyond belief. He goes on, it was the next sentence that got me. He said, when I look at my cousins, all of whom are MDs or PhDs, they have no comparable wisdom to his grandparents. When they speak of the relationship between husbands and wives, parents and children, the meaning of life and death, they speak in the language of cliché. No depth, no meaning. I said, it can't be that bad. And basically what he's saying, I think his thesis is that without a great book underpinning your life, it will be incoherent. And it will not work in the long run. There are only half a dozen great books in the history of the world that have been capable of producing great societies. As Chesterton pointed out a long while ago, the biggest one was animistic paganism. But that only runs the tribe and really the village. It won't develop, because the explanation of all the existential problems of life are couched in terms of evil spirits, which makes perfect sense. If you live in Central Africa, half your children die before maturity, your crops fail apparently at random, and you have some of the worst governments in the world. What evidence is there of a God of love in that story? Not much. And yet the gospel is flourishing in Africa, like it's not flourishing here, which is amazing, but true. But that story is simply, it will provide for that society, but it cannot work for anything bigger. The moment you send animistic pagans to big cities, they become corrupt because there's nobody to keep them in order. In the animistic pagan system, I've sat and watched, and I'm sure you have too, that when there's a problem in the village, they'll all sit round and they'll talk perhaps for 2 days. The chief doesn't say a word. Everybody who wants to speak is allowed to speak. And then the chief has to sum up and say what we're going to do, and he better be good at it if he's going to go on being chief. So it works at that level. But it's not the noble pagan like the liberals would have you believe. It's a fearful environment. People die of fear in that context. Evil spirits are real. They're not powerful except by deceit. Fascinating, the first time I was in a village when a witch doctor arrived, and quite clearly everybody was scared stiff of him. But when I talked to him, he said, I can't touch you. Your spirit is too strong. Now, those were categories I'd never thought about in those terms. And we think that much of what we do in North America is just human behavior, but it's not. It's human behavior with a certain history. And when that history gets lost, the behavior changes, and you can see it happening before your eyes. So when I went to medical school, none of the girls were sexually active, because they were sensible, and they were not going to lose their virginity without at least one ring, and preferably 2 rings on their finger. So there was no sexually transmitted disease. Now when I talk to a first-year class at university, I know statistically 25% of the girls have a sexually transmitted disease, which in most cases they don't know about. That's that's progressive, isn't it? But not the sort of progressiveness you want, but the sort you're getting. And they don't want you to talk about it. And you're not dealing with this in your homeschooling and classical schooling programs, are you? That's why you need something between you and university. So when I got back from Africa and then said something like this to medical students, they got on my case, got angry with me, and I said, hang on a minute. It wasn't me that said it was Alan Bloom, so I'm not going to apologize, but why don't we find out whether he's right? You would all agree the Sermon on the Mount is great teaching. Tell me how it starts and what it says. What do you think the answer was? How many of you could tell me the Beatitudes in sequence? 1. If you know them, if you've memorized them, that's not enough. When you know them, you don't memorize them because they are logically sequential. It's the most coherent sequential sermon the world has ever heard. Now, they couldn't do it. So I said, there you are. Yeah, Bloom's right. And then, bless them, they said, well, what are you going to do about it? And my response was, nothing. It's your problem, not mine. I was a very sympathetic professor. And they said, but you claim to know something we don't. Why don't you teach us? And without even thinking about it, I said, well, what you need is an Agnostics Anonymous group, because you don't even know the questions, let alone the answers. And they said, that's right. And so AA was born on the spot. And I taught it as an extracurricular course for the next few years. And it was a lot of fun. Proving to them that objective moral truth must exist every year. And I enjoyed it, much to my disgust at one level, because at the same time the Christians said, are you going to help us keep our faith going? And I said no there as well, or was about to, till my mother came at the back of my head and said no, and I said I'd do 4 weeks Bible study, and I ended up doing 10 years. And of course, once you allow these young people into your home, you then start to like them, and then they wreck your life, basically, is the way it works. But you know that. You start homeschooling, you get to know your kids more, and you love the fact that they're learning, and that's it. You're a servant. Welcome. It's what you're meant to be. But that, as I walked away from that first conversation, I realized that I couldn't give a coherent account of the whole Sermon on the Mount myself. Now, if you're made to be a professor, and it's not something you go looking for, if God has made you for that, you can always tell what God's made you for. You can do it without getting neurotic about it. So professors giving lectures is not a problem. That's just the kind of mind we get given. We might forget whether we got our trousers on, as one famous professor at Cambridge, his wife called the porter and said, my husband's left this morning, I'm not sure he's wearing his trousers, can you check? And she was serious. But his lectures would be fine, you know. That's the world you belong in. So I could give lectures without notes. Sometimes I went with the wrong notes just to see if I could get away with it. At least it kept me awake in the lecture, you know. That you get like that. But I couldn't do that for the Sermon on the Mount. So I learnt the whole thing by heart. And then I learnt that it wasn't in the Bible. We've only got the lecture notes in the Bible. It now takes me 3 hours to do the Sermon on the Mount after comparing Scripture with Scripture. And it transformed my life as a whole. Nothing has been more important in my life than that exercise, which was due to a homosexual Jew in Chicago and a bunch of unbelieving students who got me going. But once that started to happen, in any city, as far as I can see, there are usually elderly women who seem to know what's going on in the church. And one such woman called me and said, I hear you're doing things for Sermon on the Mount. I said, get it the other way round, you'd be nearer the truth, but yes. She said, will you come and teach our adult Sunday school? I thought it was a liberal church. I said, give me 4 weeks and I will, and I went. And as a result of that, I met another professor in the university, a professor of philosophy, who'd come to see what on earth a biochemist and a pediatrician was doing teaching the Sermon on the Mount. And we started having lunch together and complaining about the state of the modern multiversity. We did that for a week or two, and he said, yeah, well, there must be others in the university like us. Now, I knew some medical academics who claimed to be Christian, but you'd never get them to stop for lunch or to stop for anything. We knew a couple others, and then they found 2 more. We ended up with a little group of quite remarkable academics who are now scattered all over the continent that God had put together in one place. And we'd all watched young people like your young people arrive at university in one state and depart in another. What do you think the university is most likely to achieve with your children? What difference do you expect them to come back with? I want to make you say it if I can. You must have some expectations, right? What do you expect to be the net result of the university?
Absence of faith.
Sorry?
Absence of faith.
That's right. Something like an 80% probability of having their faith at least damaged, if not removed. That's not what you intended, is it? We'd watch this happen. We're all 6 of us were Christians, of course. That's what brought us together. We didn't know what to do. We knew one thing: going to Bible school makes it worse, because you then come with a naive view of Scripture and quoting it rather naively, and clever professors take malicious pleasure in taking you apart in public. So you're totally cowed. We didn't know what to do. We knew what not to do. So we decided we would have a reading group. And we started reading everything we would find on the nature of education, beginning with the Greeks and ending with Alistair MacIntyre in the 20th century. And by the time we'd finished, first of all, graduate students started joining. First they sat at the next table, but they weren't talking, they were listening to us. So we said, you might as well join us. In the end, we had no paper trail, we kept no records, but we would have between 20 and 30 people to breakfast every Tuesday. And it got as far as China. We were even head-hunted by the Chinese government, but that's another story. Quite quickly, the graduate students recognized what we were saying and put it into words in a way better than we did. They said, you're complaining that we're not properly formed for you to be able to teach us. And that was the truth. You see, 50 years ago, to get into an English program anywhere on this continent, you would have to be fluent in a modern language and a classical language as well as English. Now you only need English. You have to be very, very strange to think that that's progress. But that's the way they describe it. It's just getting rid of dead white males as far as they're concerned. But the dead white males did it all, so you're not left with much except rubbish. I mean, the stuff that children read in high school now is unlicensed pornography in many cases. So it was them, and then the homeschooling mums and dads and the like, and the classical schoolers started asking you to go to conferences, and we were a bit appalled to see that some of the people teaching there were still in the thrall of the Faculty of Education. And then they said, well, when are you going to do what needs to be done? Because what you need is to understand yourself as the product of Hebrew and Greek thought modified by the church, because that's who you are, in intellectual terms. And we can't do that in the university, and I can show you why immediately. On my travels, every now and again in a liberal university, I try not to talk about Augustine College there, but it comes up. And then usually some woman will get up and say, which women occur in your History of Ideas program? Now, I know how to escape this particular catch. I say, well, I'm just a humble scientist. Please tell me the women you think ought to be in a course on the history of ideas. And there's a kind of shuffling around, and I hear Hildegard of Bingen and Marie Curie, and then I hear Marie Curie and Hildegard of Bingen, and so it goes on. There are a couple more, but that's about it. No, the history of ideas is a male thing. There's all sorts of reasons for that, one of which is women have got more sense. I mean, to say that you're going to make a contribution to the history of ideas is rather more stupid than saying I'm going to win the lottery. It's not going to happen. There's only about 200 people that really matter after 5,000 years, you know. It's not a thing you do by intent. But men are tunnel-visioned. Women, you've probably noticed it, you know. If you go out on Saturday morning and leave your husband with the children, when you come back, it may be that there's no tap in the house that drips anymore, but the house is in total entropy, right? And he didn't even notice. He didn't do it on purpose. As one of my friends said to my son's wife, you have to believe they don't intend to do it. We are tunnel visioned. You are peripheral visioned. Your eyes are actually wired differently. Fortunately, it's a woman who sorted this out. But women have much better peripheral vision than men. It explains every argument you've ever heard in a car. Because women see what's happening ahead and to the side milliseconds before the guy does. But when you're driving towards a gap and she says slow down, you can hit the accelerator. Because men judge gaps to an order of magnitude more precisely than women. Spatially, we're on different planets. Now you can say in the university that women are much better in languages than men, and nothing will happen to you at all. But as the president of Harvard discovered when he said we have difficulty getting women into the higher levels of mathematics, he lost his job. But it's true, and there's a good reason why it's true. God made us differently. So what we needed to do was to think about how we did that, and we've done it. We teach the history of science, medicine and math, art and architecture, history of literature, history of the church. We do teach a course on scripture. We teach Latin to make you a bit more logical. A short course on classical logic and a short introduction to the trivium. And we read Augustine's Confessions together. That's the basic structure of what we do. It takes 8 months. And the students who do it go off to university, and we've been doing it 20 years. They have about a 90% probability of coming away with a flourishing faith and having destroyed a few professors en route. It has succeeded beyond our wildest dreams. So much so that my task now, because I'm the wrong side of 75, is to see if we can get this clone somewhere else. I was talking last night to some profs from VT. I think this would be an ideal place to do it, actually. You've got all that you really require, because you only need about 6 people to do it. If they're university professors, they don't need to be paid for doing an extra lecture a week, which they'll really enjoy. If there's a bit of money in the kitty, they can have a bonus and have a party at the end of the year, you know, that will do. But you will need a little bit of money to make it work, but not much. We managed to just stay the right side of the red on $7,000 a year for tuition, which is pretty good. And for that, you'd get your first year at Wheaton. Even Chicago has given us credits, none of which is official, of course, because we only teach one course. We'll never have official credits. But we're known now across the continent, so as long as students have got the patience to wait, any university will let you in at the last minute if you're good. And we need to get you to the end of the 8 months, because your writing skills go up exponentially in the last half of the second term. And then all we have to do is say, where do you want to go? What subject do you want to do? Let's see if we can find somebody on the inside of the bureaucratic barrier. Send your best essay and say, have you got a first-year student who could do this? The answer is always no. Will you go into BAT? The answer is always yes. And away you go. Houghton begs us to send more. Last one, they gave 2 years advancement to encourage us to send some more. It really works. And what's really delightful is to watch young people really enjoying learning, which is rare now. When I say to students in the multiversity, Socrates wanted you to end each day at university. After all, it was his invention, in principle at least. He would like to think of you falling into bed at the end of the day and saying, what a day, I'm wiser today than I was this morning. You ever had that thought? Of course, none of them ever even crossed their distant edges of their mind, because wisdom is a word that doesn't occur in the modern university. Eliot saw it coming in Choruses from the Rock. Where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge we have lost in information? And he didn't know about computers, but that's all they've done, isn't it? They've made information freely available and made it possible for professors to give you exams that they don't have to mark, which cause you to behave like a 5-year-old, and you can no longer do it. It's neurosis, left, right and centre. Hopefully, in the next little while, we will see the emergence of courses with no requirement for memorization. I taught 20 years ago, I started a course in biochemistry that had no requirement for memorization because I couldn't catch the cheats. So the only thing I could do was to make cheating of no value. The exam did last 8 hours, and it did sort out those who could think from those who couldn't. And it also meant that all the students who thought they were going to get an easy A dropped my course, which is marvellous. In fact, the objective of the first lecture every year was to get half the students to drop the course, because I didn't like marking. And I didn't like marking courses of people who weren't actually interested in the subject. And when you got rid of them, the course was much better. And I think a lot more of that should happen. The university at the moment is holding its nose and taking your money, because there's far too many people in university. It should be cut by at least a third, and everybody would benefit, including those that don't get in. They wouldn't be wasting their money. And one of the good things that happens with our course when they've done that, some of them we discover they're nice kids, they're reasonably intelligent, but they're not academics. And they'll say, I'm thinking of one in particular, he said, well, it's been a tough year, I've learnt a lot, I've enjoyed it, and you've given me a reading list that will last me the rest of my life. Now I'm going to community college to learn some skills and set up a business, and he's running a very successful business now and is therefore a supporter of the college. Perfect. Now, I should stop and see if you've got questions. Congratulations on what you've done so far. We love having home and Christian school kids, more the home school than the Christian schools, unless they're the classical schools. Most evangelical Christian schools are too evangelistically orientated, and so they allow far too many unteachable children in. They end up with the unteachable kids in the city, and if you have too many of them, they ruin the whole ethos. So they're not achieving as much as they should because of that. You can't redeem everybody. We will not take everybody into our program. You've got to be able to write. We're not doing remedial writing.
Back at the beginning, you were
Yeah.
listing 6 things that a student needs
Yes.
to do. I missed several of them.
Okay,
Perfectionism.
slowly, I'll say a bit about each, and then you'll have a chance to write them down. The first one is reductionism. And the important thing to realize is how old that story is. It goes back at least until the 14th century with Occam. And Occam was trying to defend God, which you should never do. He can defend himself perfectly well. But what he produced was nominalism, and he said that things like love and truth and justice are just words. They have no existence. The only real things from our point of view are what we can touch and smell and feel, and their extension in instruments. That goes from nominalism in the hands of Descartes and then Bacon. It changes the meaning of the word fact. Before that 200 or 300 years, moral facts were more important than physical facts. At the end of those 200 years, facts have become physical facts, which is the way we use them now. When we say, tell me the facts, we mean physical facts. But for the medievals, moral facts were more important than physical facts. And of course the medievals are right and we're wrong, because science is almost invariably wrong. What we do in science is we build one set of models that explain things, and then we knock them down and build another set. So our models are largely provisional. I mean, Newton had a good run, about 300 years, but he's been pushed out, except at 1G. He's easy to use, but he's not adequate for cosmology. And the fact that it works doesn't prove that it's right. That's an American problem. You know, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. No, that's wrong. If it's wrong, fix it. Ptolemy's model of the cosmos was wrong, but it was just as good as Copernicus's for predicting eclipses and the like. It took Kepler to come along and make the next step to get a better model, and then Newton. So reductionism is simplifying things in order to learn. Galileo knew perfectly well that friction was real, but he neglected it for his physics by polishing the wood very vigorously so that friction was very small. And he didn't know it, but he ended up putting a man on the moon. He started physics as we know it in many ways. Most of the big moves forward had no practical implication at the time. His did have, because they helped gunners to become more accurate when he realized what the actual trajectory of a cannonball was and worked it out. But most of them didn't. I mean, the classic story in that direction is the famous one of Niels Bohr going into a common room in Britain in the 1920s one evening and looking very happy, and a professor from the English department says, "Niels, you look as though you had a great day." He said, "I've had a wonderful day." And he said, "Well, sit down, let me buy you a drink, tell me what you've done." And he said, "Well," he's a theoretical physicist, he said, "this afternoon I convinced myself that the atom is not the ultimate particle, it can be split." "Oh," says the English prof, "and what, pray, is the relevance of that?" And Niels Bohr thought for a moment and then said, "Fortunately, none whatsoever as far as I can see." I mean, relevance is a post hoc decision, and it was quite a few years before Einstein went to the American president and said, "You have to make an atom bomb." But in embryo, it was there in that common room that afternoon. So the American, if it works, it's okay. No, that's not okay. You still want to pursue the truth. And that's why Christianity had such a major role in the development of modern science. Particularly experimental science. It's virtually unthinkable for somebody who doesn't believe in a creator God who is on our side. I'll leave you to think about that. And if you want to read about it, and you probably would like to read it. Have any of you read any Rodney Stark yet? No. Read Rodney Stark's For the Glory of God this summer. It will help your homeschooling, and you'll find it very interesting. Because he was brought to faith by his interest in the sociology of religion. But particularly in that book, the chapter on the handiwork of God is brilliant, because in one chapter he does what it takes a standard textbook, a book, to do. The standard book for the early history of science is David Lindbergh's book, The Beginnings of Western Science. But Stark does a very decent job in one chapter, so you don't have to bother with Lindbergh. So reductionism is simplifying things in order to understand them a little better, particularly if it has some benefit in better understanding. Now, I maintain that Protestantism was a reduction for good reason, and it didn't work too well. And obviously when Luther came along, if you read something like Taylor's A Secular Age, the Catholic Church in the late 14th, 15th century was in a very bad way. I mean, they had some of the worst popes that they ever had, who made their own children pope, had multiple mistresses, etc., etc., even worshipped Greek gods in the cathedral on occasions. It really was in trouble. Indulgences were just the tip of the iceberg. So certainly Reformation was necessary. And then along come the Reformers and say sola scriptura. How long did the Reformers agree about what sola scriptura was? Not even one generation. I mean, Luther and Calvin none of them could get on with one another on what that means within one generation. It's a lovely concept, but putting it into practice, not easy. Now, of course, when quantum physics actually works its way through the system, the theologians will be a little different, because as one famous quantum physicist said not long ago, he said, if I meet anybody who says they're doing quantum physics and not thinking about God, I don't really think they're doing quantum physics. Because, of course, God clearly has at least two systems of mathematics that don't fit together in our hands. And the way we talk about things is the way we talk about things, and some of them are hard to understand. When one particle appears to go through two holes, you have a little problem with comprehension, don't you? And that's quantum physics. As Robert Spitzer puts it, there's lots of room for prayer in quantum physics. If you say, I mean, it can be analysed as waves or particles. And do you know what? If you set up an experiment with particle detectors, at the end of the experiment, it behaves as a particle. And if you set it up with a wave detector at the end of the experiment, it sets up as a wave. It can do either. It's neither, obviously. And as Robert Spitzer says, calling it a wavicle doesn't help. The mathematics always works, but we have no metaphor. And it's very hard to communicate in ordinary areas where the only language that works is mathematics. But it should give us a lot more sense of humility in the face of God. I look upon theology as man's attempt to understand God. I mean, it's not divine writ, is it? We read the text and we make what we can of it, and when we find we disagree, we ought to have a little more humility than we currently have. We're not doing well in that area. But I think it's going to change, because certainly if you do leading edge science, you have to be in awe of the world in which we live. In molecular biology, there are very few people who are actually in any way really interested in evolution. In 20 years in our department, I don't recall a single discussion about Darwin. There's a first paragraph of the grant always had some little evolutionary comment because it was required to keep people happy, but nobody cared. Tinker's hoot. They wanted to know how to make things work. The problem is that a lot of people don't have enough imagination. I mean, when the first double reading frame was discovered, it should have blown everybody's mind. It blew a few, but not enough. I mean, it's a little throwaway story, but it's fun. It's one of the best things that ever happened to me, and so I love telling about it. I've been to Cuba to teach a good many times, mainly medicine, but from the first time, the pastors discovered me and said, can you teach us as well? So I did that as well. The government knew I was doing it, and they let me do it because they liked the other part. Anyway, on one of those trips after a lecture, a gentleman comes up to me, and he turns out to be the head of Marxism and Leninism in the local university. And I said, what are you doing here? He said, I've come to see you. And I said, oh, why? And he said, well, the students tell me that you say Russia rotted from the inside. It was an ethical failure. Not Reaganomics didn't bring it down. And I agree with you, he said. And when Russia collapsed, I didn't want Cuba to fall into the hands of the mafia like Russia has. So I stopped teaching Marxism and Leninism, and I started to teach multicultural ethics. But the students go to sleep. But he said, they tell me they don't go to sleep when you teach ethics. So will you debate me tomorrow morning in front of the faculty on the nature of human ethics? What a wonderful opportunity. Of course I said yes. And I prepared and had various starts that would work, but I knew there was a better way to do it, but I didn't know what it was. I was absolutely certain it existed, but I didn't know what it was. And God didn't tell me till I got up from my seat to walk to the lectern. And then he changed the first 10 minutes of the lecture in my head. It wasn't my lecture anymore, but I knew what to say. And I asked my translator, a Canadian Colombian, write on the blackboard, this message assembled itself. And then I asked them, in Spanish obviously, I said, if you'd come into the lecture room and found this written on the board, what would you make of it? And of course, it's a sentence, it's got a verb and a sort of noun, but it doesn't mean anything because messages don't assemble themselves. I said, quite right. Now I turned around, crossed out the word message and put in DNA, the genetic code. I said, but you do believe this sentence, this DNA assembled itself. But it's exactly the same sentence. DNA is not a mechanism, it's a message. It's a blueprint. It's a blueprint in code. It's the most brilliant code the world has ever seen. God only needs 3 letters, and he only needs 4 letters, and he only needs 3-letter words to define you and me. And he can put the blueprint for you and me in every cell in your body in 2 meters of DNA. You couldn't even fold it in that space. I mean, the folding alone of DNA is a miracle of the first order. And when it folds in slightly different ways, it produces different genes. So when you went to school, it was probably one gene, one protein. You know what now? It's what the record currently, it's probably gone up since I last looked, over 30,000 proteins from a single gene. This is just out of this world. The probability of this happening by chance has got so many zeros before you get to a number, it's not worth even thinking about. But the world is going to change in that direction. It can't go on this way. They're going to have to yield. But of course they don't want to say it's God. Even Dawkins knows it can't happen by chance. But he says somewhere else it happened by chance. You know. It didn't. And so the world is changing. Now back to, you've got number one then, reductionism. Don't let people reduce the gospel. Tell it with all the mystery that you can attach to it in your own life. Telling your own stories aloud. And the more you put yourself into, allow God to take you out of your comfort zone, the more amazing those things will be. Just about this time last year, I was in Africa. I'm in Africa about every 2 years. I didn't want to go this time. I'm getting older, my neck aches on long flights, etc. So my wife said, it's time to go. We've got a daughter who's got an orphanage there. Not many people go to Zimbabwe to teach, and I do. I like going when I get there, and they like me going. South Africa worked me very hard, but I didn't want to go. I was being curmudgeonly. We saw Joanna, had the one and only night in a hotel so that they could get a break from their mission station. And then we went to the airport in Malawi to fly to South Africa. They went through security, such as it is. The waiting room was nowhere near big enough, so Sally got the last seat. But the guy next to her had put a bag on a seat, so I said to him, "Sir, is that seat taken?" And he looked up from his Kindle and said, "Oh, no, please, sit down." And to make him feel better, I said, "I don't notice what's happening around me when I'm reading either." And he said, "Have we met?" And I said, "A bit unlikely, isn't it? Two white guys in the middle of Africa." And he said, "It's your voice." I said, "Yeah, really?" He said, "Yes, you gave some lectures in Cape Town in 1999, didn't you?" And I said, "Well, somewhere around then." And he said, "I was a medical student at the time. I actually missed the lectures, but they were recorded, and I wouldn't be in Malawi, which is the best 2 weeks of my life, if I hadn't heard you. It's such a joy to meet you." God does that sort of thing when you need a little encouragement. I mean, it sort of tingles up your spine, doesn't it? But that's our God. But if we insist on doing it our way, he'll say, "Oh, carry on, do as you wish." And you miss out on the bigger deal. And I think you're finding that even with homeschooling, because you must be seeing your children come to life in areas you wouldn't have dreamed of, right? And remember, it's not you. I mean, you've been used, but there's more than you at work. So the next one is relativism. And since you have a homeschooling group or classical schooling group or whatever it is, every year you could put on a skit, because Peter Kraft has written a very nice little skit for you in which you will have moral relativism demonstrated to you and how to talk about it. The book is called The Best Things in Life. It's published by IVP. And what Peter does as his teaching tool is to bring Socrates back from the 4th century BC and pop him down now on your campus. And in this particular, the last chapter of that book is written as a dialogue. You don't even have to it's written as a dialogue. So if you've got two actors, you're home. And Socrates meets this young woman who's not working very hard and basically partying, which is a common phenomenon. And she says, "Well, all truth is relative, isn't it?" And Socrates says, "I think we'd better have a tutorial." And so they have a tutorial, and in 35 pages of double-spaced dialogue, he takes her world apart without making a statement. It's very well done. If you really enjoy it, you can then go to the adult version, which is published by Ignatian. It's called A Refutation of Moral Relativism, and in that one he uses a sassy black American feminist and beats her up with a Muslim scholar, who of course is a moral objectivist. Very clever, because in both cases he keeps any anti-Christian rhetoric out of the discussion, which is fine, perfect. Always look for an atheist to make your point if you can. They are gold. Honest atheists are the best apologetic material we can find. I use them all the while. So moral relativism is dealt with there. There has to be objective moral truth, otherwise there is no learning. But All four forms of relativism are dealt with in the adult one, not in the junior one, so to speak. That's metaphysical, epistemological, moral, and religious. We're suffering in all areas. The next one is tolerance, which is dealt with in that discussion. Most people would be a little intimidated about standing up and saying, I'm intolerant, right? And if you're called intolerant, they usually mean you to be insulted. And I say, yes, I am. Now can we discuss whether my intolerance is justified? And if you think about it, to short circuit for you, you could rewrite the 10 Commandments, couldn't you, as the 10 divine intolerances. I, the Lord, will not tolerate 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. You can rewrite them all easily that way. That's a bit exciting, isn't it? And have you ever noticed what introduces the 10 Commandments in both Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5? Before you get to the first thou shalt not, what's the immediately preceding verse? Got that one?
I am the Lord thy God that brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage.
That's right. Could they do it on their own? So grace introduces the law, which is wonderful, isn't it? There's no way they could have got this stuff together themselves. It's the gift of God. So the law must be thought of as grace, an act of grace. It is the only framework within which freedom can happen, even now. That's what the law is, the framework within which freedom can happen. So legitimate intolerance, expressed in that way, is in fact the framework for freedom. And it's easy to illustrate. I always use the same illustration because it's mine, so nobody can argue with it. It happened to me. Some years ago, asked to give a talk in the Canadian prairies in a Mennonite community. Talked too long, as usual, so it was too late to go back to Winnipeg afterwards. The doctor invited me, took me to his home. He drove into his garage, didn't lock it, left his key in the car, went into his house, didn't lock the door, said it's late. Your room's at the top of the stairs. I couldn't resist. I said, isn't leaving the ignition key in the car a trifle careless? And he shrugged and said, oh, you never know who may need it. That is freedom, isn't it? And they have that freedom because they teach in school, at home, and in church that thou shalt not steal is not an imposition, it's a gift, and it defines who we are. And it does. And in your rural communities, Thai, probably because he's careless rather than because the community is that Christian, lives that way too. And so do we in the country where we live in Canada. We don't lock our door, and there's our second car, which you have to have in the country. You have to have a backup car. It has the ignition key in it. People use it and I get free gas. It's a good deal. But that is freedom. And it's not all over the world. You tell that story in Johannesburg where they get out of their cars with a semi-automatic weapon cocked in their hands. They laugh, and it's not ironic laughter at the thought that you could live in a community where you can leave the ignition key in the car. That's a gift of history. It didn't happen quickly either. Conversion makes you redeemed. It does not make you good, does it? That's a process that takes a long while. From an animistic society becoming Christian to the emergence of Judeo-Christian ways of living, you're measuring in centuries. So it's just beginning to happen in Africa. I'm seeing a few, not many, a few. You need at least third-generation Christians to have reliability. You're not likely to be reliable in the first 2 generations. You know what the truth is, but you all acknowledge that, don't you? That our problem is not knowing what we ought to do, it's still doing it. But you also, I hope, know people who've been brought up in good families over a long time, who've been obedient to the truth. They don't even have these thoughts. As Lewis puts it in the Screwtape Letters, and Screwtape is complaining that he's allowed his patient to get into a Christian family. He says, even the dog smells of Christianity. You know, that's the way it should be, that it works its way through. And I think we need to think a lot more about how virtue is created. Liberals in the university know that the virtues that are needed for the practice of science are dying. When I started in experimental science, it wouldn't have occurred to me that people might cheat. that they might fabricate data. Now we have no idea how much is fabricated because there's so much money involved from a Darwinian point of view. There's absolutely no reason why you wouldn't cheat because you can get away with it, except that you screw up the literature. Science would be less reliable. It's progressively becoming more and more unreliable. I used to say that medical students, 20% were not trusted by the rest of the class. One of our graduates from Augustine just a few months ago wrote me a note saying, you've got to up that figure. In my school, he said, I don't trust 50% of them. And the 50% I trust are in the bottom half of the class because the top half of the class are involved in a very sophisticated cheating cartel. That's Texas A&M, one of your better medical schools, I always thought. Another professor in that university last year failed a whole class for unethical behavior and resigned from the university because he saw no way of dealing with it. That's the world that our children have to deal with, so we've got to help them to prepare realistically for what's involved. So that's tolerance. The next one is multiculturalism. And to be against multiculturalism is, that's dangerous. You probably should be locked up. I wrote a paper about the myth of the multicultural patient before 9/11, and I received a lot of very bad press until after 9/11. Because quite clearly cultures are different, aren't they? The thing that's really upsetting about that blind mullah who was going to try and blow up several bridges and buildings in New York is that he wasn't crazy. He was a very, very good scholar, and he was proud of what he was trying to do because it's what he clearly could show was part of Muhammad's teaching. They want it to be that they're crazies, right? Well, they're not. They are fundamentalist, if you like, because they're sticking to a 14th century old set of documents that were written in stone, which is a pity. The metaphor is often misused. Writing in sand is okay, you can rub it out. Jesus, of course, when people asked him questions, he'd usually say something like, well, it's a very good question, let me tell you a story, now you go figure it out. And we've been figuring it out ever since. And it has all the flexibility, nuances for one age which were not present in another one, etc., etc. There's not one interpretation of Scripture. It's just as he can overwrite in DNA and write instructions in the same sequence of letters, he can do the same in the Bible. I think we're beginning to be more sophisticated, but we're not trapped like the Muslims are. That's their problem, they're trapped. But multiculturalism in medicine is the easiest way to show this won't do. Medicine doesn't work in any culture. Muslims are far too fatalistic to be good doctors. If everything in the world is Muhammad's will, is Allah's will, what on earth are you doing trying to change it? Doesn't make sense, does it? Whereas we're told to pray every day, thy will be done, thy kingdom come on earth now. We've got every reason to try and undo the effects of the fall. We're told to in the prayer we're supposed to say every time we pray. Jesus doesn't occasionally say the Lord's Prayer. He says when you pray, say it. Every time, I think, because it is the model, and the more you do it, the more you realize how rich it is. So very different. But the story I use, and a good story is worth a lot. And a few years ago now, good 20 more years ago, I saw a little girl, and she had a septic knee which had been neglected. There was pus in the femur and pus in the tibia, the joint was destroyed, she was septicemic and dying. And the only thing one could do to save her life at that point was to cut off the leg, get the pus out and fill her with what antibiotics we had, because this was in Africa. And I told the parents that's what we would have to do, and they said, well, we need to think about it. I said, well, the OR will be ready in 20 minutes. And in those 20 minutes, they took her home to die. We didn't do the operation. And she undoubtedly died. Nobody recovers from that. And I was the only person who was horrified. And I'd done pediatric ward rounds that morning, so I said to the nurses, can I talk to you? And they said yes, and providentially asked the right question. I said, what would they have done if this had been a little boy? And you know the answer, don't you? They said, oh, they would have done the amputation. I said, why would you treat little girls and little boys differently? And And they gave it me on a plate. They said, in our culture, it is a woman's job to till the fields, fetch the water, cook the food, and bear the children. A woman with one leg cannot do those things, so she'll have a life not worth living. If you're a multiculturalist, you must accept that view of the relative value of little girls and little boys as the one I hope you have. Cultures are different, not equal. They're incommensurable. And we need to talk about that. I want pluralism. I don't want to suppress anybody's religious rights, except over violence, but I want them to have to defend them in public. And they will die if they're... We have things to learn from them. Those same Africans will not believe that we in the Western world, particularly in the US, have people who are so poor that they cannot afford health insurance when other people have it, which was certainly the case, wasn't it? They say, surely you can help one another build a house and you can look after one another. Of course they would do that as far as they're able. Of course it's very unsophisticated, but they're not going to leave people out on the cold. They are better than we are on that particular sense of what communal duties to one another are. So we need to talk to one another and learn from one another as far as we can, so that we all get the best that's available, the best that human thought has achieved. That's pluralism. Now the next one on the list is the sanctity of life. I don't recommend that you do much on that in the modern university until you are a little bit more confident. It is possible. It took me 20 years before I was willing to do it. I was pro-choice for 20 years over rubella babies. Telling a woman that she had a 90% probability of major cardiac and or neurological problems is very difficult to do. It's much easier to say, this pregnancy's gone wrong, would you like to start again? And invariably the woman would say yes. And the word abortion was never used. It was strictly illegal at the time. So you just have to come into hospital briefly and then you can start again. And I felt no guilt at that point. And that's the key. We are using the verb feel when we should be using the verb think. Despite the fact that the guy I chose to deliver our first 2 children, because he was the best obstetrician in the hospital, but not yet a consultant, and he never got a consultant job because he wouldn't do abortions, because they were legalized shortly after that. And I didn't think about it until over 20 years later. And one afternoon I went into my office and left my lab to function on its own. God was getting at me, taking away my interest in the protein that had kept me off the streets for 20 years. And I sat down and asked myself the question, can I think that a woman should have a right to an abortion? And I realized at the end of the afternoon, not only could I not think it, but I could probably put it in such a way that she would not want it. And I said nothing about it. I didn't want to do anything about it. I didn't want to get involved in that can of worms, like most doctors. But my wife, always causing me trouble, had set up a website. I said, nobody'd ever go to a website of mine. Why are you doing that? And she said, because people they tell me, we didn't know he was in whatever place it was, and we would have driven that far to go and listen. She said, I can't tell them all where they are, but I can put your program on a website and then they can find it. And of course she was right, I was wrong. Students in particular, of course, they're always playing with their machines, so I'm one of the things they trudge through every now and again. So I was going to Ann Arbor to speak, and the students from Detroit called and said, we see you're going to Ann Arbor, you have to go through Detroit from Ottawa, will you talk to us first? And I said, sure. And then they said, it will be January the 22nd. We want you to talk about abortion in Wayne State University, the black university with the highest abortion rate, in the middle of the day. I said, no, I don't do that. And they said, why? I said, I've no desire to be lynched in public. And they said, but we've heard you do it. We've heard you speak. We think you could do it. I said, I'm still not willing. And then they said, we've been praying about it. And I knew it was going to happen. And so I said, as long as it's a lecture room with an escape hatch by the lectern and you take me to Ann Arbor, fine. The lecture ended in total silence. as it has done every time since. I've done it all over the world, but you need to learn to do it. I think on the MP3 file I've given you, I don't know whether it's on there. What's the one? Making Sense. It was recorded in the University of Minnesota, and I also have to remember the Justice for the Unborn is the title. It's not on there. I may have one with me somewhere, and I can give it to Ty, and you can copy it, but it's worth learning. But we can win this argument. And it's going to be a very big one for euthanasia. I mean, it's already underway in 3 of your states, and it's going to be Canada this year. The Western world is giving in to killing patients. And we need, I don't think we can win the argument, but we ought to be able to win dividing the healthcare system. Any of your churches yet talking about euthanasia? No. You've got to do it. It's important. I do have with me, I think, let me just look. No, I don't. I've left it behind in the Ty's house. It's very, very important, because if it doesn't happen, there'll be no Christian doctors for you when you die. Because Obama has made no provision for conscience rights. So a doctor is going to be faced with the choice between defiling his conscience or losing his job. Not a nice choice, and not a just one in a democracy. Why should the small group of liberal elite tell the vast majority of people, who, when you can sit them down and make them think their way through it, you don't want your doctor to kill? It should be anybody but a doctor. Hippocrates understood that 2,500 years ago, that the only good, they had very few medicines, so trust was important. Rationally, are you going to trust your doctor more or less if he's willing to kill you? I mean, that's a no-brainer, isn't it? Especially since when you die, your assets go to somebody else. There are always people who might want you dead. Bribery and corruption will emerge very rapidly. It should be anybody but a doctor. I would like lawyers to do it. That would make complete sense to me. 6 hours would be plenty of time to train to kill somebody. Why should they make the laws and then make other people suffer by them? They should do it themselves. But you do need to get involved in that. And you can get Ty to come and talk at your church about it if you're not doing it. Because we've got to start with the churches. Because it may come to civil disobedience. To force them to recognize the rights of people to be able to go to a hospital where people are not killed. On grounds of democracy, it should be about 50% in the US. So that's the sanctity of life. And then finally, Judeo-Christian sexual ethics. And there isn't time to discuss that at this time of night, but do download Janet Smith's talk from the web. Janet Smith, Contraception, Why Not? It will upset you, but she's brilliant and she's funny and she's clever. And she's right. There was only one person who actually understood what the pill would do when it came along, the contraceptive pill. And that was the Pope at the time, Paul VI. He said this. He said, the problem with this first effective contraceptive is that it will do 3 things we don't want. First of all, it will produce a contraceptive mentality. Has it done that? I mean, why do high schools give the pill to 14-year-olds and less? Secondly, it will lead to a general lowering of morality. Has it done that? Yeah. Thirdly, it will lead to increased disrespect for women. Has it done that? Yeah. And actually, there's a 4th one that the Pope didn't know about. The net economic effect of the pill has now been demonstrated to be the removal of money from women and children and giving it to men. There has been a net movement of wealth from women and children to men because of the pill. And divorce and contracts, which don't work. So we need to repent, basically. The Catholics got this one right. We should choke on it and admit they're right and get on with it life. And our lives will improve. Now, any questions? That was one question. It took a long while to answer. Sorry. If the question is, can you go home? The answer is yes. Please do.
We do have a few more minutes. Questions?
I'd love you to send one of your smartest students to us so that they can come back and enthuse you with making the next step of having a bridge between the school system and the university. They love it when they come. I should warn you, however, they have about a 10% probability of finding their spouse, which is amazing to watch. It's the most beautiful thing that happens. I had no idea, because we've only had just over 200 in 20 years. We run, I think the mean is about 13 students a year, because we have no advertising except my travels. But last year's was a classic one, beautiful one. The summer before, I was taking part in a Ravi Zacharias apologetics conference in Toronto, and Ravi's secretary for Canada came up to me after the conference. She's in her late 20s, and said, "I'm going to come and take your course next year." And I said, "Oh, sure you are. You're going to leave Ravi and come and take our course. Yeah, I'll see you when you arrive." And she arrived. Meanwhile, at the other end of the country, there was a young man in the same sort of age who'd got a degree, had got a good job in IT, but was not satisfied with what he was doing. And he heard me doing a conference with Apologetics Canada, and another apologetics conference with about 1,500 people there. So I didn't know he was there, but he decided he was going to come. So they both turned up in the next session. And there was another one in the same age group, so there were 3 old ones and half a dozen or more younger ones. It's nice having the two groups, because the older ones tell the younger ones, make the most of this, you're never going to have this kind of teaching again. And anyway, they went through the first term, went off for Christmas. When they came back, Steve said to Brittany, "I want to say something to you, and you might not want to hear it, and you can tell me to shut up, and I will. But I want to tell you that I think I thought about you every day during the break." And she looked at him and smiled and said, "I thought about you too." And they're getting married next month. That must be one of the best ways to find a spouse, isn't it? Where you enjoy one another as people and as all the gifts that God has given without giving a thought to bodies until considerably later. It's the right way to do it. Yeah.
Several families are trying to decide about university.
Yeah.
Saying that, what sort of, you mentioned not all students who are in university now should be. How do we, all of our children are of course very gifted.
Yes, that's
extremely brilliant.
Of course.
How do we help them sort through that sort of decision?
With great difficulty. Really, you need to know who's going to teach them now rather than the university. And you've got to be very careful about that. And that's why we started this course. Once they've been prepared, they can handle things more easily. That first year is very dangerous, so anything that enables them to come in at second year is ideal. Because most universities, they don't learn anything the first term. I say that if they come unprepared, they lose their mind, their faith, and their virginity in random order in the first term. I mean, that's a bit cynical, but not a lot cynical, if you see what I mean. If you go and look at the Yale Sex Week, for instance, that would blow your mind if you've never looked at it. You probably don't even know what's going on. That's the problem. But they actually have a Yale Sex Week every year, and it is what it says it is. So you need to think about where you're going. And you can't even rely on so-called Christian colleges. They've got to be prepared to stand on their own feet. Now, obviously, if you're in the science, technology, engineering end of the spectrum, they still believe in truth. The essential thing to understand about the arts faculty is truth has inverted commas now. It's ironic truth, i.e. not truth at all. But they still take a salary, which I find very difficult to defend. But that's where we're at. So they need to really want to do what they're going to do. They shouldn't use it as a fill-in. We're a much better gap year than they are. And if they don't want to do us, they still shouldn't go to university. A better gap year would be go and work in a mission hospital or something like that for a year. All things that give them time to mature and see what the world is like. I mean, people do get through. The Holy Spirit is quite capable of doing that, but we shouldn't knowingly put our children in the way of experiences that are highly likely to be bad.
So some sort of training ground.
Yeah, some sort of training. Yeah. And particularly about the kinds of things I've been talking about tonight, being able to deal with those. When they can do that, you'll be a good judge of their level of maturity, but it's a lot to ask. And we're cheap. And as I say, I must have a finite number of years left. I don't want to see the thing die. We have been gifted with an approach to the introduction to higher learning which works. It's got to be cloned. And in the long run, of course, we win. If we can also win the thing about contraception, that would mean on average we'd have 4 children instead of 3. And just imagine what that would have done to American political demographics if Christians had simply been having 4 children instead of 3 over the last 50 years. Obama wouldn't have been elected. You wouldn't be having any of the troubles you're having now. We're paying the price for what we've done. Now, obviously, Christians are having on average 3, which is pretty good. We're way above the curve, and some secular demographers are really very worried about us. But it needs to be a bit more.